My thinking was that it would be really great for us to actually spend some time together, just sort of speaking about any aspect of the business that you want to speak about. As some of you may or may not be aware of, let me tell you a little bit about the fact that I'm also been working for a few different record companies for quite a while. So my education and knowledge of the business is fairly wide. So we can talk about anything we want to talk about. We can talk about equalizers, compressors, record business, where the record business is going, where I think it might be going, what I think is going on, what I think I don't know what's going on, etc. It's fairly wide range. So why don't we just have a fun time talking about everything we want to talk about, no matter what it is. I'm more than happy to go there. You remove bleed from tracks. 100% matters. Matters this way and only this way. If you have a song where the actual drum track is shuffling, meaning that there's a lot of inside notes on the snare drum where the drummer is purposely dragging the stick on the snare and he's sort of shuffling the beat. Commonly this happens like on a 3/4, any kind of a waltz, a 3/4, 6/8, anything like that, where if you're not careful, especially with the waltz, right, it can feel like you're chugging along with a bottle of beer in a bar somewhere. So it's really, really important in that case that whatever amount of shuffling exists to make the record not feel so stiffy, that you don't get rid of that with a gate or going in and cleaning it via inside Pro Tools, whatever your DAW platform is. Now if you have a record where you really want it to sound punchy and clean and more perfect and almost machine-like, because that's what it calls for, then of course you would go ahead and you would clean it out. So it's really a musical choice. On Big Girls Don't Cry, the auto-tuning, first of all, the vocal on Big Girls Don't Cry is the demo. Wasn't recut. In fact, that was, for me, largely what drew me to working on the song. Is when I heard the vocal performance, I was so taken by it. And it was tuned by another person, not myself, and who's fairly aggressive in tuning. He's pretty aggressive about tuning, so he tuned it pretty hardcore. I wouldn't have tuned it quite that hard, but that was what they wanted to do. I pretty much send the mix to the client very much like it's going to be the actual final master. I don't believe in taking the mix and putting any kind of loud limiter on it, whether it be an L16, L1. I mean, there's a million ways you could do it, because I don't think that's representative of the mix. And I've really never understood that concept. People use finalizers, they use all kinds of things to get the level. At this point in time, being that all those mastering tools are in our hands, I don't understand the concept of waiting for someone else to do quote-unquote finishing / mastering, etc., when you don't know how it's going to alter it. I mean, we all know on this webinar that how hard you compress something, limit something, finalize something, it all affects all those balances. So how does not only the client, the artist, the producer, but how does the mixer himself know what he's got? I think at this point in time, when I give most of the projects to the mastering people, there's really not that much for them to do. The truth is, it's pretty much like, don't screw it up. We really have it on target. Please don't screw it up. What drives me as an engineer, it's a funny thing, it's my only fear I have. The only insecurity, fear I have, is that I wake up one morning and I want to do something else other than this. I want to, whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is, I just want to do something else. Most people I know that do what I do for a living that are successful have their own, for whatever reason, internal drive to do it. I love doing it. The idea of going into any kind of creative technical environment, taking the tools that exist and manipulating sound and music together to create and find that magical place where the song becomes alive and everyone loves it and it changes people's lives, is beyond my, I can't tell you what joy that brings me. I absolutely love doing it. So I'm just driven by an innate desire to do it. Nothing else motivates me. My name on an album doesn't motivate me. Money doesn't motivate me. Fame, whatever it is, none of that motivates me. What motivates me is actually hearing the song come out of the speakers and having artistic, the people who create them tell me that's what I was intended and I was never able to get it. The other thing I really enjoy doing right now that's kind of starting to happen a lot that I see happening is working with what I call laptop artists. These are all the artists now that are making records on laptops, or should I just say making records in non-commercial professional environments. Those kinds of records are really, really a lot of fun to make and work with those kinds of people. The one thing that's probably never going to go away on people like myself is the IP we have, the intelligence of and experience we have of making records and everything that is. And being able to work with coming to the studio or going to someone's home, which I just started doing, going to someone's home and sitting with them in their laptop and helping them. Because what's happening is, as these laptop artists, going back to how I initially started this, they don't have the ability to get it. They can get it so far. Maybe they get lucky and they hit an 8 on a good day, but they can't consistently get all their songs up to the 9, 10, and more importantly, to what we call like that magic X Factor fairy dust place. They don't know what it is. They've read many things. They've talked to a lot of people. They've watched a lot of videos. They know what they're supposed to do. They know where they put the equalizer. They know how to compress. They can go buy all the cool plugins that different people are making that have presets that can get them in the ballpark, etc. But they can't get the record to have that magical special thing. And that's where experience and people like myself come in. So I believe the marriage between us that do what we do for a living and this whole new crop I see coming is, to me, very, very exciting. And I don't know how much it'll be done in a commercial environment, but that's something I'm looking forward to, actually. A little off your question, but it kind of relates. Who do I think is an artist that should check out and why? Good question. That's an interesting question, because there's probably sometimes artists that we think that should check out. The one thing we should always keep in mind is that once a contender, always a contender. In my opinion, these last Grammy Awards, the artist that I remember most that I think stole the show was Mick Jagger. And I think a lot of people might have thought, Mick Jagger can't, like, next to Lady Gaga, next to Rihanna, next to etc. You would think that he wouldn't be as compelling, but I was at the show, and everyone I spoke to agreed with me that he was by far the most compelling element. And what was shocking was Mick Jagger didn't have any bombs, didn't have any explosions, didn't have any fancy lights, didn't have 25 singers. Actually was singing somebody else's song, because it was a tribute, with not even his band. And the song was very simple. It was 3 words in the chorus. That was it. And he had to do it for 3.5 minutes with no extras other than himself and a microphone, and that's it. And he did it. So, and I've seen shows prior to that that weren't that great. So if I had voted for him, for instance, because he's been around for so long, to exit, I would have missed that incredibly compelling performance. So I don't know if I'm the right person to answer this question, because I don't know if I would say anyone should exit. I think someone should exit if they feel like they should exit. So it says, "Hi Jack, thanks you for your time. As a starting producer, what is your recommendation to get our names out there and tracks and image of product?" I know this. I know anything you're attached to that's great will get you out there. I have to be careful what names I use, but there's a few artists that have just come out recently that should actually very easily take the whole thing by storm based on their past performances and who they are and how they've penetrated pop culture, and they're not. And then you have artists that people think will do okay, and they do incredibly well. And it's because the song's amazing, because the production's amazing, the way the record was together is amazing, and that is what always wins. Any kind of like smart Twitter marketing, Facebook marketing, right place, right time, network handshaking place, all those things are cool and help, but nothing is as great as when you actually are part of making a record that is absolutely fabulous. That's what changes the game every single time. So I think that the importance should lie on really making the best records that you can, and other artists and other people in power will hear those records and go, who is that guy, who did it, I gotta have him. And that's how it happens every single time. The way I've been mixing songs is not how I used to mix songs. Meaning that now that we have what we have as far as the ability to recall. For instance, I'm in a room right now. I'm in Ocean Way Studio D, which is a huge Neve 88R. And I have my room set up in such a way where I can recall anything I need in close to 12 minutes, give or take a few minutes either way. So what I do is, for instance, I just got an album to mix. I started mixing 3 days ago. And what I'll do is I'll go through the 11 tracks, I'll work on one, and I'll get it up to a place where I feel it's making sense, and I'll go to the next one, I'll go to the next one, and then I start doing a round robin of the 11. I keep going around them. And what I discover by doing it this way is it's kind of like leaving it up overnight a whole bunch of times. By the time I get to the third round of the 11 songs, I find myself employing on all the different songs things I've learned about the other songs. When people are making a record and recording a record, you don't know exactly how they recorded it, and you don't know exactly what tools you have will react in which way with any of those particular songs. So what you do is you find yourself going along working, and you're like, oh gee, this really works great on the vocal, this really works great in the bass, I wonder if we work on the other song. You try it, sure enough it does, and then you try it in the third one, the fourth one, and before you know it, by the time you hit your fourth round of the 11 songs, they all start sounding really good and cohesive and like a great body of work. Also, what I try to do in my first round is get a lot of things set up that I like to have set up. My side chains, maybe certain ways I want to compress or EQ something, or in my mind I have a certain image or perspective of what I think that artist is and what I would like it to sound like. So maybe I'm using a certain set of delays consistently, or reverbs, creating a certain perspective I think that fits that act, creating their soundscape, for lack of a better description. And I want to employ that in all 11, so that when I get to the second round or the third round, and hopefully by the time I get to the second round or the third round, I'm now at a point where I'm hearing it so much as a cohesive, beautiful piece of work that I can now start creating. I'm past the technical aspect of, oh, this pans this way, this goes that way, this is kind of the basic relation. I don't have all those mundane technical things now. We're out of the way, and I'm just hearing the record for what it is. I'm hearing the songs for what they are. And that's when I can really start creating, because I'm now out of that technical space. So when you ask me how long does it take, I'd have to, I guess, look at the song over the period of 4 to 5 days and mix that entire record and break it down to how many hours I spent on it. That's really the way to answer that question. The mixing in the box and mixing the analog thing is interesting. As time goes on, I find myself mixing more and more, not in the box, but more with the box. There is no question whatsoever that analog sounds best. It's not maybe, not kinda, not sort of. And if you consider the fact that the analog designers, engineers who create the equipment, have had 40 to 50 years to perfect it, versus the digital people who've only had really a decade at best to really hone it in, of course it can't be as great as analog equipment. If we look at just the small amount of time that we've been working on digital, the quality of it has massively jumped from where it was. So it's sort of not fair to compare the two yet, in my opinion. I think the digital, it's going to take a little more time for it to catch up. But the real way I sort of view it, honestly, is that digital has a sound. And forever in the history of pop record making, part of the sound that you hear in commercial records are what dictate what people want. So whether we like it or not, when the 80s came and SSL took hold and they had compressors on each channel, and then they had the stereo compressor, which obviously the API and the Neve consoles and all the different consoles that were around at that time, the Tridents, etc., none of them had that. They weren't built that way. So as the SSL came, it's the way that console was built and the way you drove it, so to speak, and used it created a sound, the 80s sound, which was a sound that was very compressed and in your face, and what I call implied power and implied tonality. You didn't hear real tone, you didn't hear real power, not like a 60s record, or actually more like a 70s record. You weren't really moving the air, the woofers weren't really working. Your mind told you it was powerful, your mind told you it was big, because you did it with compression and you did it with reverbs. You didn't do it with the actual tone of the instruments. So you weren't really moving the speakers or the air the same way. But that was the sound that was popular at that time. And then when that sound became popular in the 80s, and that was the sound, if you didn't get that sound, then your record didn't sound like what was transpiring in the commercial environment. If you're making records for the commercial environment, you can't ignore what is in the commercial environment. If you're making records, a jazz record, or any kind of record that it just doesn't, I picked that particular domain, but that's because generally they're free of it. But if you're working on a record where the sound doesn't matter in terms of its commerciality, it doesn't need to sound like other things, it can be its own thing, then it doesn't matter. So how this relates to the box analog thing is that the box is becoming the sound. As the more and more people mix in the box, and as our industry is the condition that it's in, it's financial global condition, and people are now starting to make records in not professional environments, not in commercial environments, but in any kind of environment, whether it be a garage, a bedroom, a building turned into a recording studio, etc. And due to finances, or just due to the fact it's just the way it happened, they're making the record in the box, the more hits that are made that way, the more that becomes a sound. And that sound is not something you get in the analog domain. There's no question about it that when you're in the box, the type of mid-range you get and the way the bottom works, and the way the top end feels, is all relates to how it works in the box. It's all part of the converters, it's all how the DAW is set up, it's all how that little console works, the dithering, everything about it. It's a sound of its own. And as those records have hits, that will be the sound that everybody wants. Well, I know a lot of the presets with the plugins because I spent a tremendous amount of time creating them. So yes, I do use them. I use a lot of the plugins as they were designed. And in the last few months, I've been pulling some of the plugins up purposely and putting them on things they're not supposed to go on, like maybe the bass plugin on a vocal, vice versa, etc. And finding that in some cases there's some really brilliant happy accidents. It'll take me probably another 8 months, maybe a year, for me to forget how they were built and what they are, so to speak, to be able to use them without knowing what they're doing and just actually be able to put them up on something and move the knobs around like you would, not knowing what they are. You know, when we first put them out, there was a tremendous amount of people wanting to know what was behind the GUI. And this is sort of a taboo subject, so I'll be very careful with it. But I was the only one out of all of us that had these plugins that was very aggressive about, I don't think we should talk about what's behind the box, behind the GUI. And the main reason why I thought that was important was I wanted everyone to have the freedom to not know what was behind the GUI, to just use it. You know, if I in a mix situation with you, and I tell you that I've, if you are the artist and you say to me, turn the bass up, and I tell you I've done it, but let's say I accidentally reached over and grabbed the wrong fader, not on purpose, but just as an accident, and the guitar was right next to the bass, for instance, and I thought I had pushed the bass up, but actually I pushed the guitar up, we would both very easily, no matter how many records you've made, no matter how many experience you have, we both could actually hear and think the bass was louder. So the object is to continually get your brain out of the way and your ears, and actually trust your ears and listen to what your ears are telling you. Not what you think you're hearing, but actually what you're hearing. It's a really, really important lesson. And so with me, I wanted people just to have the plugins, and if it said attack, punch, whatever it said, that's what it was. Not like, oh, he got a punch because he put this with this and this with that and that with that. Like, now that's wrong, because now you have a preconceived idea of what any of those plugins might be. Some were created just for the GUI. In other words, they don't even exist outside the GUI, and some were ones we already had in Waves that we used, a little bit of both. But let's take the case where there might be something that was already in existence. You might then start hearing what you think the plugin is doing based on what you know about that particular type of plugin. And so now your brain's engaged. And I didn't want that. I wanted you guys, I was really, really hoping to make something for you guys that could really let you create and not have to go through the labor of the bullshit of stringing together a series of plugins like we do when we're mixing. I wanted you guys to be in that creative space where you can just grab it, put it on, and it gets you really close to where you want to go fast by picking a preset, and then you're able to manipulate. My plugins were the concept of them was simply just that they were really I wanted them to be something that was like a soundscape. I didn't think of them as like, okay, here's a reverb and here's delays, and because reverbs and delays and all those kinds of perspectives to a mix are so like, there's no stock setting. I can't just put down there's an eighth note, a quarter note, and a half note. Well, not really. I mean, sometimes you don't want exactly a half note or exactly a quarter note, or sometimes the amount of feedback needs to change even between a section or another section, or there's too many parameters that need to shift if you're really, 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 really detailing a mix properly, that to have just an organic stock choice of one reverb or three reverbs or three delays, to me, is almost insulting to you. It's almost like you don't know how to, like you don't know what you're doing. I don't want to treat anybody like that. I would rather have something that, again, was sort of a soundscape, where you had punch, attack, and things like that that we know are important, that will for the most part work on most things. You can't get it to work on everything, but you can certainly get it to work on 80%. And with a little bit of manipulation, you might be able to get up to a 90 or even 100. So that was the thinking behind my plugins. So I use them all the time, and I'm looking forward to the day that I actually can just use them without knowing what was in them. So I have that freedom that I just try to describe to you. I throw up the drums first, but what I do is I throw them very, very quickly, as fast as I can. So the only time I stop and spend something on my way to getting the record up for me to hear it is if there's something that's just so out of whack that it has to be dealt with. And then I'll fix that so it doesn't pull my ear and grab my attention away from hearing the big picture. But I'll throw the drums up very quick, kick, snare, overheads, room, hat, just very, very fast. Bass, vocals, quickly get the guitar up, get all of it sounding kind of up, and then start moving it all together as a unit, so I can kind of hear what it is. And again, that sort of applies to my initial question, the question I was asked earlier about how much time you spend on the mix. I'll throw that together very quickly, and then I'll already have an idea based on the rough mixes I was sent, because I'll spend time listening to them. And I'll have an idea of kind of what the band's about, what they're like. Hopefully I know their past history. I will have spoken to them about where they're going, what their influences are, what they're doing, because I want to join the band very quickly. And I'll throw down a lot of, as I said earlier, a lot of the templates on my first round after I've thrown up the faders fairly quickly, again starting with the drums, and get it to a place where it's kind of making sense and it's technically kind of sound, and then I'll start listening to the song and start moving things and tailoring it for the mix. My ideal vocal chain. Um, here's the real truth. You know, we could have started this webinar off with me opening up a Pro Tools session and showing you a bunch of plugins and showing you, yeah, I limit this like this, and I do this like this, and I do like that, and the truth is, by the time we'd be through, if we went that route, all of you would be like, okay, well, I've read that exact thing in Mix Magazine 10 times, 4 in EQ, and 7 in Tape Op, and I saw 10 webinars that the guy said the same thing, and I saw 7 videos. Here's the truth. The truth is there are only so many choices, right? And for whatever reason, there are certain things that always work, right? So we all know that the Fairchild is probably the Bentley / Rolls Royce of the compressor. There's nothing really better than it. It pretty much can almost do almost anything. It's an amazing piece of equipment, which is why it's worth what it is and why there's a limited amount of them on the planet, and which is why we also chose that to do first before we did anything else. We thought about 1176s, we thought about LE2s, we thought about LE3s, but I didn't want to go that route. I wanted to do initially the tube equipment because it's dying, it's going away, and I wanted everyone to have it. And I was fortunate enough to have the choice of so many Fairchilds and so many Pultics that we could pick the best of those and archive them and have them for everybody. There are special 1176s, there are special LA3s, there are special LA2s, but there are many of those special ones. There are only a few magical Fairchilds and Pultics that are really magical, and partly that's because they're just dying. You know, they're 30, 40 years old, they're dying. And the parts that exist for them are hard to get, and the ones you can get are not even as good as what was in them. So that's why we chose that first. So when you say ideal chain, you know, sure, a Fairchild is pretty hard to beat. And by the way, you'll find that the B side is always better than A side 90% of the time. No one knows why. My next choice probably is a 1176, and then the 2254E Neve. Now it kind of depends on the key of the song. You know, if it's a key where the guy's voice is being pushed really hard and there's a lot of aggressive music you got to get over, sometimes the Neve can be really fantastic in terms of rounding out the singer's voice. But I'm finding that lots of times I like to use the analog compressors. So I just mentioned 3, 1176, the Neve 2254E, and the Fairchild. But I find lots of times that I like to use a digital plugin as well, only because obviously it doesn't do the same thing as the analog does. And when you get the two of them working well together, it's pretty hard to beat. So I wish I could be more like perfect with you in terms of like saying this is what it is. It's always this module, it's always this compressor, but see, it really isn't, and that's why I didn't want to start this webinar like that. If Scott, if there's another an actual, I want to satisfy the answer to your question, but I can't tell you there's one magical chain. There just isn't. I've used Fairchilds, I've used 1176s, I've used LA2s, I've used LA3s, I've used the air compressor, I've used the ear, I've used Altic, I've used a little bit of everything. But it seems to always be that you can't go wrong with the first 3 I mentioned. One of those 3 are generally going to work almost always. Okay, I've observed that when you think about equalization, it's really just sophisticated bass, mid-range, and treble controls, if we reduce it down to its simplest form, or complex filters, however you like to look at it. But with compressors, because there's a time and a release, they affect the way that musical instrument hits you. So if you have a note that has a certain duration and you're compressing it with a long release, for instance, where it's going to hold a note for a long time and slowly release it, it's going to actually lengthen the note, correct? If it's set with an attack where you're grabbing the note real aggressively, real fast, and then releasing it real quick, and there's a large pop or attack or transient to the front of that note, you're going to perceive those notes, that instrument, as shorter notes. Therefore, the record might even feel faster. So that's what I mean by changing the feel. That's the simplest way to answer in terms of changing the feel. I mean, we all know that you could take a drummer that is kind of stiff feeling, right? And if you were to put compressors on them like the older Altic compressors or the Fairchild, another time you could, that's another good example of it. Or any kind of compressor where you really have it kind of wheezing, and the Audio Tracks Waves Audio Tracks is like a genius at this. It's like probably the best, one of the best, if not the best. Audio Tracks you could take and run all your drums into it, or sidechain it and add it and really hit it hard and make it really wheeze, and you can make the whole drums feel like, oh, they're not stiff anymore, like they're really feeling like they lay back in certain places, and the cymbal hits and the note hits really beautifully, and the note holds on real long and then decays back, and the bass drum's talking to the cymbals and cymbals are talking to the bass drum, and all of that changes the feel of the way the drums sound. So that's my best way of answering that for you. I don't know if the loudness wars will ever go away. I think that as digital becomes greater and greater in terms of the ones and O's, and then figuring out how to make it work better and better, we'll have less and less artifacts. But it's always a loudness war, because to the ear, the louder one always seems more exciting and better. And unless there was a way to get everyone to agree that volume doesn't matter, I don't know that it'll go away. You're always going to have people going, I want mine to be the loudest. When you have people who have multiple producers, multiple mixers on a record, they're all hitting the mastering engineer trying to get theirs louder than the other guys, because again, louder is perceived as better to the ear. And when I say louder to the ear, I mean to the perceived better. Of course, we're talking about the uneducated ear, right? We can hear the difference, and we don't like it. The problem, the real big problem, actually, the biggest problem for me is that as these things become louder and louder, they're being played on systems that can't handle the level. They were never designed for that kind of level. So the amount of distortion and uncomfortableness that comes with the inherent electronics of that device being worked too hard, that's the drag. And that's what's making, that is one of the many things that contribute to the condition of our business. You can definitely talk to people that are 12, 13, and 14, and you can ask, and if you really watch what they listen to, for the most part, a lot of them will listen to the older records, and if you talk to them about them, they'll tell you they like the sound of them. But the people that sort of control, that being a lot of the record companies that sort of control all of that, are going to pick the record that sounds the loudest, the most exciting, what they feel like is like on the radio, so they can feel like they're competing and they're making something that's compelling for the consumer to purchase. They're not thinking about the sound. And a lot of them, as time goes on, less and less people are aware of what those records sounded like. They only know what they grew up on. And if you grew up, if all of us on this webinar grew up on 50s records, we would think that was the sound. That was cool. So it just depends when you grew up. And if you're in power and you grew up in the 80s, for instance, well, then you think that's the sound that's cool. That's the sound that you want to go after. That's what you think you want to make happen. So 80s is the beginning of this level compression war. And it hasn't backed off, and I don't see it backing off. I think there's two ways to answer your question. First of all, you can never say to yourself, I'm going to do less than the best I can do, because it's going to be played on an MP3 player that may not have great quality, or because it's going to be listened to earbuds. That you can never, ever, ever, ever put a limit on yourself. You should always be striving for the absolute best, imagining that everyone's going to listen to it in the absolute best environment and actually be able to hear the difference. You can never put a governor or a limit on creativity or excellence. Never, ever, ever, ever. The one thing to keep in mind about the earbuds, the question you have about the earbuds or the MP3, is that the one thing that matters probably the most that relates to that is getting the mid-range right, because it's the only thing that's really in common to everything. Whether you're in the grocery store or in the newest BMW with the newest cool stereo system, or someone's home whose father so happens to have a crazy theater system that sounds amazing, or your system that you've built that sounds amazing, or a brand new pair of headphones that you paid $900 for, whatever it is, all those systems have mid-range. They all have different abilities in terms of the top end and the bottom end, but they all have in common mid-range. So the mid-range is the most important, in my place, in my feeling, is the most important thing to get right. People get very obsessed about the bottom end, they get very obsessed about the top end. Neither one of those matter to me. I think they matter. That was a blanketed statement, I should say, but what really matters is the mid-range. That's the one thing that matters. That's where the soul of the instruments live, and that's exactly the place, the band, again, that's common to all systems. So I always make sure that's as great as it can be, so when people listen to it on earbuds and MP3s, they're actually hearing the music properly. I generally mix at low volumes for the most part, and if I'm balancing, really doing critical balancing, or any critical decisions about pitch, time, or feel, I listen at an extremely low level. And that is to take the listening environment out of the picture, meaning the reflections in the room or the sound of that room, how much reverb or natural reverb or echo that room might have, that control room might have. I don't want the electronics playing a part of it. I don't want the speakers working hard or the amplifiers working hard. So they're adding or decreasing artifacts of any kind. So I'm not perceiving the sound properly, and I don't want my ears to be folding because I'm listening so loud that I can't hear properly. And then even in 45 minutes or an hour where I think I'm hearing something, I really am not because my ears are closed down. That's not smart. So I listen at a very low level, and once I really feel really, really great about what I have, I'll crank it up for my own satisfaction to see if I enjoy it. It's important to me that the records have what I call crank factor, where you can really crank it up and really get off on it. I don't like the records when you'd rather listen real low because at a loud level's too much. Then I think you're hearing the electronics and you're hearing all the manipulation as opposed to the music. You should be able to really turn it up and really enjoy it, but your balances should stay intact on all the different levels. Horns, the reverb is really important on horns, and I don't mean long reverb, but like, because the horn, if you think about a horn, it always sounds the most magical, the greatest when it's in an environment that's not dead. I don't know if you ever heard horns like in a real dead room, unless you're going for an effect, but just generally speaking, they never are that alive because they really work on reflections. They really work on the ambient character of the room that they're in. Been my experience. That's why they speak the best. So for horns, to really make them bump, I always make sure that I have an ambient feel around them that fits them and really showcases their tonality and their attitude the best they can. And as far as strings, that's exactly the same thing. Compression is real important to both too. The plugin string section of the plugin has a lot to do with the compression and the mid-range, getting the right bump in the mid-range so you hear the attack of the strings and hear the rosin of the strings. Again, I sort of always refer to the mid-range as the soul of the instruments. And there's also a tremendous amount of compression on there because strings, as you very well know, are so dynamic. And in pop record making, dynamics can become an issue in terms of them getting lost. So you've got to bring some of that lower level of them up. You don't want to turn them into, obviously, something that you can't really appreciate. They're dynamic, but you've got to get them at least a little bit close. The favorite monitors to mix on, speakers have to do 100% with you, meaning that all of us hear a certain way. We all have a certain inherent curve that we acquire innately at birth. And so the object is to find speakers that help you listen properly. If you're a person who, who doesn't hear, for whatever reason, just has your ears have a lot of activity at 7K, for instance, and they don't have very much activity in the low end, for instance, for whatever reason, just the way your ears are built. Maybe they're small, maybe they're big, maybe your head cavity is big, it's small. I mean, these are things that you can't affect, you can't help. The object is to find a speaker that fills the opposite area where you're deficient, in a sense, so that you're hearing properly, so that when you take it away, what you think you're hearing is actually what you're hearing, and it's what other people would be hearing, because the speaker is fixing and making you go in a direction that you normally wouldn't go. It's very, very, very important. That's the best way to really answer that question. I've mixed records on NS10s, I've mixed them on Genelecs, I've mixed them on JBLs. Like for me, I can't mix on JBLs very well because they have too much of that lower bump in the lower middle. And so I become too satisfied with the way that lower bottom is. And I find myself hearing the records outside in another environment going, gee, why am I missing that lower middle? And that's because JBL's strong there. And so when I'm listening to the record, I'm like, oh, it's got plenty of lower bottom, but it really doesn't. So that's the most important thing. Like with a Genelec, you have very smooth mid-range. So if you have a tendency to make smooth sounding records and you're on a Genelec, you're going to make a really smooth record. It'd be more important to be on a speaker that would do exactly the opposite, that would help you make the record not so smooth, so that when you get it out, it's actually where it needs to be. I would always just, my actual reference is I'll just go on iTunes lots of times, and I'll click on all singles, and I'll little needle drop. I'll just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. I'll go on a few records that I worked on. I'll go on other people's records that I know, records that I've currently heard on the radio, maybe even driving to the studio that day. I keep refreshing and keep listening to all the different people's work. I find a lot of other people's work sometimes inspiring. And so I like the idea of listening to different things because it's kind of exciting, and obviously we always have our own interpretation of what someone's work might be or someone's record might be, and that interpretation is not the same thing, but it leads us to something else that's great, or at least it's fun and it's challenging. So I don't have one single thing. Like I don't have the CD that has the 2 songs that I think are the definitive sound, because I don't know if there is a definitive sound. The sound changes for all the different records. I hope at the end of my career, people will view me as a great record maker, not as a person who did one kind of sound really well and that's all he tried to do. I would rather be thought of or known, or hopefully accomplish the ability to make the mixes or the records sound what's best for those songs. And I don't even care if the same record, they don't all sound exactly the same. It's how do I get the song to come to the forefront and sound the best and the most live. Very complex question. I'm trying to figure out how to exactly dive into it. I guess the best thing the best way to answer that is I get a feeling about a song. I'm extremely lyric driven. That's pretty much what I hear first. Then melody and the band second and third. But I generally listen to what the singer's talking about, and when I hear what the singer's talking about, the lyrics are, that gives me the idea and the feeling of what the song should feel like. You know, if it's a depressing song, obviously that's one feeling, and if it's an uplifting song, that's one feeling. And if it's a song of confusion, maybe the verses are taking you through different emotions of feelings of someone trying to figure out what they're doing or trying to find out where they're going. I will kind of try to get that feeling. So the truth is, I don't know that any of us really know exactly how to arrive to some of those feelings. You know, I know that I keep working on it until I get the feeling that I think is the right feeling. And I don't know necessarily even how I get there sometimes. I just know, like, all of a sudden I'm like, that's it. Now the song feels like it's supposed to and what they're trying to actually communicate. And I know I've successfully done this a tremendous amount of times because I've had artists say to me, how did you know what was in my head? How did you know that's what I was thinking? It's exactly the thing I've been trying to get. And in fact, I've worked with 2 other mixers or 2 other situations and they haven't been able to get it. You're the first ones to be able to get it. So I think the lyrics are what tell us where to go. And the reverb and delays and panning and even equalization, all of that affect the accesses, the dimensions, the depth, the left and the right. So it's really complex. I don't really know how else to answer it other than the way I just did. I involve the artist in the mixing as much as they want to. I think what's important is that when you're working with the artist, the first thing you need to do is get the song to a place that you feel is exactly what it should be. Keep in mind that the artist conceived the song one day in their head. They then brought it to their creative environment, whether it be their band or a producer they're working with, wherever the situation might be. They present it. They all talk about it. They all perform it. They all record it. They might record it 2, 3 times. And this could happen over, a few hours, and it could happen over a year. So generally it doesn't happen in a few hours. So when you consider the amount of times they listen to it after they've re-sung the vocal twice or 3 times, or redid the guitar solo, or redid the synth parts in the chorus, or changed the breakdown, or changed the tempo, all the times they've heard it, by the time they get to the mix, they've lost a lot of their ability to kind of just hear it as a virgin, for lack of a better description. So I think it's important for us to get it into a place where they can just hear it almost for the first time. So I like them to kind of not be around it and let me go through the 1 through 100 times of working on it, and let them come in at 101 listens where it's in really good shape. I've had artists that insist in being there the whole time, and I find that they can't tell the difference between listen 68 and listen 101. They've heard it too many times. They also lose their objectivity. Something they may have hated or liked, they may become endeared to in either case, and therefore they lose objectivity. So it's important that they just come in, say at the 101 play, I just picked that number, and yeah, I like this, no, I like this, I don't like this, that's great, no, well, let me hear that again, I'm not sure about that. All of that will go away if they sit there for the 3 hours to 2 days, the 1 day, the half a day, whatever it might be. They will lose their objectivity. But I love them to be in the mixing. I love them to come when I'm ready for them, and I love to work with them. And sometimes they will say something to you that you have to interpolate what they're saying, and maybe they point out something that you don't think is right, but it makes you find something else that is right. So they were right, but they were wrong, but they were right. But in the end, it's great. It's marketable to a very small segment. Um, Instrumental music can be licensed a lot, but it'll never ever make its way, I don't think, for the most part. I mean, there's going to be a particular case once in a while, once every few months, where you hear something like that might be on commercial radio. It'll have normally a short lifespan. But what you hear on the radio and what we call commercial drives the marketplace, in my opinion. Um, my only advice to the young aspiring producer is going to be the same, very similar to what I said earlier, which is being concerned about just making great music, great songs, great product. As far as living in Los Angeles, I would say out of all the cities, Los Angeles is the best one to live in from a standpoint of meeting people. But that's all you're going to really get is the meeting people. In terms of making the records, at this point in time, they can almost be made almost anywhere. The positive about being Los Angeles is that it still has the greatest amount of quality record studios and pretty much anything's at your fingertip you need in Los Angeles. Any kind of instrument is rentable, findable. There's a plethora of musicians, all kinds of musicians you can imagine that exist here. It's incredible. So it's a great, great, great environment for making records, Los Angeles. That's probably my favorite city, which is why I've always been here. I have traveled to the other cities, and I haven't found the other cities to be as great as a partner for making records. I would love it if the future of music 100% came back to um, the artist. You know, all the great things that we like about the artist. I feel that a lot of the mystery that drove some of the earlier uh, artists that are considered classic artists to this day, we don't have any longer. You know, meaning that with the invent of the digital revolution, which allows us to see everything, there isn't any questions anymore. You don't wonder like who's on the airplane and what are they talking about, and are there girls on the airplane, are they doing drugs, do they have a political view, do they write the songs together, do they get along, do they not get along, what are they wearing when they're not on a stage, is that how they always dress, is that how they think, all those things that you kind of wonder, the wonderment of it all has extremely decreased as the camera has been allowed into all those environments. Lots of times when I'm making records and they want to shoot quote-unquote B-roll, I won't let them. I don't want the people to see the artists in all those situations. I want people to see the artist as these great musicians and great people that maybe they're not even that. And that's the fun part. You know, the fun part is feeling that inspiration, that creativity for them all, and that wonderment of it all. I don't want to see that they're regular people. That's me personally, and I miss that. I miss that mystique, and I wish we could return to the mystique. I don't like the fact that you can see everything and know everything. I don't want to, personally. I think your imagination is the greatest nation in the world, and that's what you lose in that situation. All right, it's been really great being able to answer a bunch of questions for you guys. I'll talk to ways we should probably do this again. An hour is never really long enough, it seems like, but I want to be able to give back and help everyone the best they can, because people have done it for me when I've been coming up, and so I really want to be able to do it for everyone else because it was done for me and I know what it feels like. So maybe we can just organize another one and we can do it again. Thank you very much.